Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Appalachian Mountains, West Virginia. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1940 descended upon the remote hollows of Webster County, West Virginia, with an unusual severity. Snow fell earlier and deeper than local memory could recall, isolating the scattered homesteads that clung to the mountainsides like barnacles on a ship's hull. Among these weathered dwellings stood the Caldwell property, a modest two-story farmhouse positioned at the end of a winding dirt road that snaked through dense stands of oak and pine. The house had been in the Caldwell family for 3 generations, passed down through a lineage of hardy mountain folk who had learned to wrest a living from the unforgiving terrain. Gideon Caldwell, at 47 years of age, was the current patriarch of this mountain clan, a tall, gaunt man with prematurely gray hair and hands permanently stained by tobacco and soil. Gideon possessed the quiet intensity common among those who had spent their lives in relative isolation. His wife, Minerva, was a woman of 39 whose once beautiful features had been weathered by years of mountain life and what neighbors described as an increasing tendency toward nervous disposition. The couple had been married for 18 years, a union that had produced no offspring but had endured through the typical hardships of rural Appalachian existence. The Caldwell homestead consisted of the main house, a weathered barn that leaned precariously toward the hollow, and a small outbuilding that Gideon used for storing tobacco and various farm implements. Behind the house, a narrow creek meandered through a grove of ancient hemlocks, its waters running clear and cold even in the depths of winter. The nearest neighbor, Ezekiel Hostettler, lived nearly 2 miles down the mountain, connected to the Caldwells only by a footpath that became treacherous during winter months. According to county records preserved in the Webster County Courthouse, the first indication that something was amiss at the Caldwell place came in early February 1940. Hostettler had made the difficult trek through knee-deep snow to check on his neighbors, as was customary during particularly harsh weather. What he discovered upon arriving at the Caldwell homestead would later be described in a brief report filed with the county sheriff as circumstances of unusual and disturbing nature. The house appeared normal from the outside, with smoke rising steadily from the chimney and no obvious signs of distress. However, when Hostettler called out in greeting, no response came from within. After waiting several minutes and calling repeatedly, he approached the front door and knocked vigorously. The sound echoed strangely in the crisp winter air, seeming to reverberate longer than it should have. Still, no answer came from inside the house. Concerned for his neighbor's welfare, Hostettler tried the door handle and found it unlocked. Upon entering, he was immediately struck by the oppressive warmth inside the house and an odor he later struggled to describe to authorities. It was not the smell of decay or illness, but rather something that reminded him of wet earth and old leather, with an underlying metallic note that made his nostrils burn slightly. The house was immaculately clean, with not a single item out of place, yet something about the very air inside felt thick and heavy, as if it had been undisturbed for much longer than the few days since the latest snowfall. Hostettler called out again for Gideon and Minerva, his voice seeming to be absorbed by the walls themselves. He searched the ground floor thoroughly, finding everything in perfect order. The kitchen showed signs of recent meal preparation, with dishes washed and neatly stacked. In the sitting room, Minerva's knitting lay beside her chair, the needles still holding several rows of what appeared to be the beginning of a winter scarf. A fire burned steadily in the hearth, recently fed with fresh logs, suggesting that someone had tended it within the past few hours. The staircase to the second floor creaked ominously under Hostettler's weight as he ascended to search the bedrooms. The master bedroom, revealed an unmade bed with covers thrown back as if someone had risen hurriedly. Minerva's nightgown lay draped across a chair, and Gideon's work clothes were absent from their usual place on the bedroom floor. The smaller bedroom, which the Caldwells used for storage, contained nothing unusual beyond the typical accumulation of household items and seasonal clothing. Most peculiar, however, was the discovery Hostettler made in the cellar. The narrow wooden stairs descended into a stone-walled chamber that Gideon had excavated himself during the early years of his marriage. Here, among the root vegetables and preserved goods that would sustain the family through winter, Hostettler found clear evidence of recent disturbance. Several wooden crates had been moved from their usual positions against the wall, and the dirt floor showed signs of recent digging. A shovel leaned against the stone wall, its blade still bearing traces of fresh earth. Even more unsettling was the condition of the cellar's atmosphere. The same heavy, oppressive quality that permeated the house above seemed concentrated here, along with that peculiar odor of wet earth and metal. Hostettler later reported feeling an almost overwhelming urge to leave the cellar immediately, though he could not articulate any specific reason for this compulsion. He ascended the stairs quickly and departed the house, making his way back down the mountain to report his findings to the county authorities. Sheriff Cornelius Brennan was a practical man who had served in his position for nearly 15 years. His jurisdiction covered a vast area of mountain communities, and he was accustomed to dealing with the various difficulties that arose among the isolated families scattered throughout the hollows and ridges. Missing persons were not uncommon in this rugged terrain, where individuals sometimes became lost in winter storms or suffered accidents in remote areas far from help. However, the circumstances surrounding the Caldwell case struck him as distinctly unusual from the outset. When Brennan and his deputy, Matthias Fry, made the arduous journey to the Caldwell homestead 3 days after Hostettler's report, they found the property exactly as the neighbor had described. The house remained perfectly maintained, with the fire still burning in the hearth and no signs of struggle or hasty departure. Their investigation revealed several additional details that deepened the mystery surrounding the couple's disappearance. In Gideon's personal effects, they discovered a small leather journal containing entries dating back several months. The early entries recorded typical concerns of mountain farming life, weather observations, notes about livestock, plans for spring planting. However, as autumn progressed into winter, the tone of the entries began to shift noticeably. References appeared to strange sounds heard during the night. All was described as coming from beneath the house. Gideon wrote of being awakened by what he characterized as rhythmic tapping or scratching, as if someone were working with tools in the cellar below. One entry, dated January 15, 1940, described an incident that occurred while Gideon was tending his tobacco in the barn. According to his account, he heard Minerva calling his name from the direction of the house, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered yard. When he responded and called back to her, asking what she needed, the calling stopped abruptly. Upon returning to the house, he found Minerva asleep in her chair by the fire, claiming she had not left the sitting room all afternoon. When Gideon pressed her about the calling, she became agitated and insisted she had made no sound. The final entry in the journal was dated February 2nd, just 3 days before Hostettler's discovery. The handwriting appeared more hurried than in previous entries, with several words crossed out and rewritten. Gideon described waking in the early morning hours to find Minerva missing from their bed. After searching the house, he discovered her in the cellar, standing motionless in the center of the room with her back to the stairs. When he called her name, she did not respond or acknowledge his presence. Only when he touched her shoulder did she seem to become aware of her surroundings, appearing confused and unable to explain how she had come to be there. The journal entry concluded with Gideon's observation that this was the 3rd time in recent weeks he had found Minerva in the cellar during the night. All was standing in the same position. All was with no memory of how she had arrived there. He expressed growing concern about his wife's condition and mentioned his intention to seek advice from Dr. Whitman in the county seat, though the deteriorating weather had made travel increasingly difficult. Sheriff Brennan's investigation extended beyond the house itself to include the surrounding property. The barn contained evidence of normal winter care for livestock, with adequate feed supplies and no signs of disturbance. However, the small outbuilding behind the barn revealed something that struck the sheriff as significant. Among Gideon's tools and equipment, several items appeared to have been recently used. A pickaxe and second shovel bore traces of fresh earth, and a length of rope showed signs of recent wear. Most intriguingly, a lantern sat on the workbench with oil still fresh in its reservoir, and a wick that appeared to have been recently trimmed. The investigation of the cellar proved to be the most revealing aspect of the sheriff's inquiry. The disturbed earth that Hostettler had noticed was examined more carefully, revealing what appeared to be a recently refilled hole approximately 3 feet square and of unknown depth. When questioned, neighbors reported that they had noticed smoke rising from the Caldwell chimney at unusual hours during recent weeks, sometimes continuing well into the night, when most mountain families would have banked their fires and retired. Ezekiel Hostettler provided additional information that had not been included in his initial report. During his visits to check on the Caldwells throughout the winter, he had observed changes in both Gideon and Minerva that seemed to progress over time. Gideon, normally a man of few words but generally pleasant demeanor, had become increasingly withdrawn and suspicious. Minerva, who had always been somewhat nervous and high-strung, displayed what Hostettler described as episodes of vacant distraction, as if her attention were constantly drawn to something others could not perceive. More significantly, Hostettler reported hearing sounds emanating from the Caldwell property during his evening walks along the mountain path. These sounds, which he characterized as rhythmic hammering or chopping, typically occurred well after sunset and continued for hours at a time. The sounds appeared to come from beneath or behind the house, in the area where the creek ran through the hemlock grove. On 2 occasions, Hostettler observed lamplight moving through the trees behind the Caldwell house, as if someone were working outdoors after dark. Dr. Isaiah Whitman, the county physician, who had attended to mountain families for over 2 decades, provided crucial context for understanding the Caldwells' recent behavior. During the previous autumn, Minerva had consulted him regarding what she described as persistent insomnia and periods of confusion. She reported frequently waking in locations within her house with no memory of how she had arrived there, and complained of vivid dreams that seemed to continue even after she was certain she had awakened. Dr. Whitman's notes, preserved in his personal medical records, described Minerva's condition as potentially related to nervous exhaustion brought on by the isolation and hardships of mountain life. However, he also noted several physical symptoms that seemed inconsistent with simple emotional distress. Minerva's hands showed evidence of recent abrasions and calluses that were unusual for a woman who typically engaged in domestic rather than heavy manual labor. Additionally, her fingernails were consistently dirty with what appeared to be soil, despite her normally fastidious attention to personal cleanliness. Perhaps most significant was Dr. Whitman's observation that Minerva seemed to have difficulty maintaining focus during their conversation, often pausing mid-sentence and staring toward the floor as if listening for something. When questioned about this behavior, she claimed to be hearing sounds that appeared to originate from beneath the doctor's office, though Dr. Whitman detected nothing unusual. This pattern of behavior suggested to the physician that Minerva might be experiencing auditory hallucinations, though he noted that she otherwise appeared mentally competent and aware of her surroundings. The investigation took on new dimensions when Sheriff Brennan discovered evidence of recent correspondence between Gideon Caldwell and various merchants in the county seat. Invoices found among Gideon's papers revealed purchases that seemed unusual for a typical mountain farmer preparing for winter. These included an unusually large quantity of lamp oil, several heavy-duty tools including additional shovels and a mattock, and most puzzling, a substantial amount of quicklime. When the sheriff questioned the merchants about these transactions, they provided additional details about Gideon's recent behavior. Hardware store owner Thaddeus Morrison recalled that Gideon had made multiple trips to town during the late autumn and early winter, each time purchasing small quantities of supplies rather than making the bulk purchases typical of mountain farmers preparing for the seasonal isolation. Morrison noted that Gideon seemed increasingly haggard and distracted during these visits, often asking about the efficacy of various tools for breaking through frozen ground. Even more intriguing was information provided by Samuel Hartwell, who operated the general store where mountain families typically purchased household supplies. Hartwell reported that during Gideon's final visit to town in late January, he had inquired about purchasing several bottles of laudanum, claiming that Minerva was suffering from severe insomnia and anxiety. When Hartwell explained that such quantities would require a doctor's authorization, Gideon became agitated and left the store without completing any purchases. The mystery deepened when Sheriff Brennan interviewed other members of the extended Caldwell family. Gideon's brother Josiah, who lived in a neighboring county, reported that he had received an unusual letter from Gideon in mid-January. The letter, which Josiah still possessed, contained several references that seemed out of character for his normally straightforward brother. Gideon wrote of settling old debts and clearing the ground for spring planting, phrases that seemed innocuous but struck Josiah as oddly formal and vague. More concerning was the letter's concluding paragraph, in which Gideon mentioned that he and Minerva might be traveling to visit relatives in Ohio during the late winter months. This was highly unusual, as the Caldwells rarely left their mountain homestead during winter, and neither had any known relatives in Ohio. Josiah had intended to respond to the letter, but the worsening weather had delayed his plans to visit his brother and inquire about these travel arrangements. As the sheriff's investigation continued, a pattern began to emerge that suggested the Caldwells' disappearance might not have been as sudden as initially believed. Reverend Ebenezer Cross, who ministered to the scattered mountain communities, reported that neither Gideon nor Minerva had attended church services since early December, despite their normally regular attendance. When the Reverend had inquired about their absence during a chance encounter with Gideon in town, he received only a vague explanation about Minerva's poor health. The Reverend also provided information about a conversation he had with Minerva following a church service in November. She had approached him privately and made several statements that seemed designed to probe his beliefs about confession and absolution. Specifically, she asked whether certain types of sins could be forgiven if they were committed to prevent greater harm, and whether knowledge of wrongdoing carried the same moral weight as participation in the wrongdoing itself. At the time, Reverend Cross had assumed these were hypothetical questions related to some minor community dispute, but in retrospect, they seemed to carry greater significance. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Sheriff Brennan decided to excavate the disturbed area in the Caldwell cellar. On February 15, 1940, he returned to the homestead with Deputy Fry and 2 additional men to assist with the digging. What they uncovered in the refilled hole would transform the missing persons case into something far more sinister. At a depth of approximately 4 feet, the excavation revealed a collection of personal items that clearly belonged to neither Gideon nor Minerva Caldwell. These included articles of men's clothing, a leather wallet containing identification papers, a pocket watch, and several other personal effects. The identification papers bore the name Bartholomew Wickham, a traveling merchant who had been reported missing in the area during the previous autumn. Wickham was known to the local authorities as a somewhat disreputable character who traveled through the mountain communities selling various goods of questionable quality and origin. His business practices had generated complaints from several families who claimed he had cheated them in various transactions. However, he was not known to be violent or dangerous, merely opportunistic and dishonest in his commercial dealings. The discovery of Wickham's possessions in the Caldwell cellar immediately shifted the focus of the investigation. Sheriff Brennan began to construct a timeline that suggested Wickham might have visited the Caldwell homestead during his travels through the area, possibly in late October or early November. The presence of his personal effects, buried beneath the cellar floor, implied that something had gone seriously wrong during this visit. Further excavation revealed additional disturbing evidence. Beneath Wickham's possessions, the digging crew uncovered fragments of fabric and other materials that suggested the presence of human remains, though the acidic mountain soil and the apparent use of quicklime had significantly degraded any organic material. Dr. Whitman was summoned to examine the findings, and though he could not definitively confirm the presence of human remains, he noted that the soil conditions and chemical residues were consistent with deliberate attempts at decomposition. The investigation expanded to include a thorough search of the property surrounding the Caldwell house. Behind the homestead, in the Hemlock Grove, where Hostettler had observed moving lamplight, searchers discovered evidence of extensive digging and refilling. Several locations showed signs of recent disturbance, and the ground near the creek had been worked over multiple times. The pattern of disturbance suggested systematic and prolonged activity rather than casual or accidental digging. Most significantly, the searchers discovered a cache of additional personal items buried in a metal box beneath one of the larger hemlock trees. These items appeared to belong to at least two other individuals, neither of whom could be immediately identified. The possessions included jewelry, coins, and personal papers that suggested their owners had been travelers or merchants rather than local residents. As news of the discoveries spread through the mountain communities, additional information began to emerge about the Caldwells' recent behavior and the activities around their homestead. Several neighbors reported having observed strangers in the area during the autumn months, typically described as men traveling alone with packs or small wagons. These travelers would sometimes be seen approaching the Caldwell house, but witnesses could not recall seeing them leave the property. Martha Beaumont, an elderly woman who lived in a cabin visible from the upper reaches of the Caldwell property, provided particularly significant testimony. She reported observing lamplight in the Hemlock Grove behind the Caldwell house on multiple occasions throughout the winter months. The lights would appear after sunset and continue moving among the trees for several hours, sometimes until well after midnight. On one occasion, she claimed to have heard what sounded like voices, though the distance made it impossible to distinguish specific words or identify speakers. More disturbing was Beaumont's account of sound she heard emanating from the direction of the Caldwell property during the nights when the moving lights were visible. She described these sounds as rhythmic and mechanical, similar to digging or chopping, but with a deliberate quality that suggested purposeful work rather than routine farm maintenance. The sounds would typically continue for several hours, always stopping before dawn. The investigation revealed that Gideon Caldwell's financial situation had undergone significant changes during the months preceding the couple's disappearance. Bank records from the county seat showed that his account had received several substantial cash deposits during the autumn and early winter, amounts that far exceeded what could be expected from his modest farming operations. When questioned, bank officials recalled that Gideon had always conducted these transactions in cash and had been reluctant to discuss the source of his sudden wealth. These financial records, combined with the physical evidence discovered on the property, began to paint a picture of systematic criminal activity. Sheriff Brennan theorized that the Caldwells had been deliberately targeting traveling merchants and other strangers who visited their isolated homestead. The remote location of their property, accessible only by the winding mountain road, would have provided ideal conditions for criminal activity without risk of witnesses or intervention. The investigation also revealed evidence suggesting that Minerva's increasingly erratic behavior might have been related to her growing awareness of or involvement in her husband's activities. Dr. Whitman's medical notes, when re-examined in light of the new discoveries, suggested that her symptoms of confusion and memory loss might have been psychological responses to traumatic experiences rather than simple nervous exhaustion. Reverend Cross provided additional context when he recalled the specific nature of Minerva's questions about sin and forgiveness. Her inquiries about knowledge versus participation suggested that she might have been struggling with awareness of Gideon's crimes while questioning her own moral culpability. The Reverend noted that she had seemed particularly concerned about the possibility of absolution for those who remained silent about wrongdoing they had witnessed. As the investigation progressed, Sheriff Brennan faced the challenge of determining what had ultimately happened to Gideon and Minerva themselves. The evidence clearly indicated criminal activity on their part, but their sudden disappearance suggested that something had disrupted their operations. Several theories emerged to explain their vanishing from the homestead. The first possibility was that the Caldwells had become aware of growing suspicion about their activities and had fled the area before they could be apprehended. This theory was supported by Gideon's letter to his brother mentioning travel to Ohio, which could have been a deliberate misdirection to confuse anyone who might search for them. The careful maintenance of their house and the continuing fire in the hearth could have been intended to create the impression that they were still in residence while actually providing them time to escape. An alternative theory suggested that the Caldwells might have become victims themselves, either of associates in their criminal activities or of someone seeking revenge for their crimes. The isolated nature of their homestead would have made them vulnerable to attack, and their accumulated wealth would have provided motive for robbery. However, this theory was complicated by the lack of any evidence of struggle within the house and the systematic nature of the cleanup operations that had apparently taken place before their disappearance. Perhaps most disturbing was the possibility that the Caldwells' disappearance was connected to a breakdown in their criminal partnership. The evidence suggested that Minerva had been experiencing increasing psychological distress, possibly as a result of her involvement in or knowledge of the crimes. If she had threatened to confess or expose their activities, Gideon might have felt compelled to take action to protect himself. The careful burial of evidence and the methodical cleaning of the house would be consistent with someone attempting to eliminate all traces of criminal activity before disappearing. The investigation was further complicated by the harsh winter conditions, which had preserved the crime scenes while simultaneously limiting the ability of law enforcement to conduct thorough searches. By the time weather conditions improved enough for extensive excavation work, several months had passed since the Caldwells' disappearance. This delay meant that any trail they might have left when departing the area had long since grown cold. Sheriff Brennan's final report, filed in May 1940, concluded that Gideon and Minerva Caldwell were responsible for the murders of at least 3 individuals, including Bartholomew Wickham and 2 others whose identities could not be established. The report detailed the evidence suggesting systematic criminal activity designed to target travelers in the isolated mountain region. However, the ultimate fate of the Caldwells themselves remained undetermined. The case attracted considerable attention throughout the region, both for the nature of the crimes and for the mysterious disappearance of the perpetrators. Local newspapers carried extensive coverage of the investigation, often sensationalizing the details and contributing to a growing folklore around the events. The Caldwell homestead became known throughout the mountain communities as a place to be avoided, and the property remained abandoned for many years following the investigation. In 1943, 3 years after the investigation concluded, a hunter discovered additional human remains in a remote ravine approximately 5 miles from the former Caldwell property. The remains were too degraded for positive identification, but personal effects found nearby suggested they might have belonged to additional victims of the Caldwell crimes. The discovery prompted a brief reopening of the investigation, but no new leads emerged regarding the fate of Gideon and Minerva themselves. During the late 1940s, several reported sightings of individuals matching the Caldwell's descriptions occurred in various locations throughout the region. These reports came from travelers and merchants who claimed to have encountered a couple fitting their appearance in remote areas of Virginia and Tennessee. However, none of these sightings could be verified, and they may have been influenced by the notoriety the case had achieved in local folklore. The most credible of these reports came from a merchant named Cornelius Whitaker, who in 1947 reported an encounter with a couple he believed to be the Caldwells at a remote trading post in eastern Tennessee. According to Whitaker's account, the couple was traveling with minimal possessions and paid for their supplies exclusively in cash. The woman appeared nervous and avoided eye contact, while the man conducted all transactions. Most significantly, Whitaker noted that the woman bore a distinctive scar on her left hand that matched a mark described in Sheriff Brennan's original missing persons report. However, when authorities investigated Whitaker's report, they found no corroborating evidence and no other witnesses who could confirm the encounter. The trading post owner had no specific recollection of the couple Whitaker described, and the isolated location made follow-up investigation difficult. Like other reported sightings, this incident remained unverified and added to the speculation surrounding the Caldwell's fate without providing definitive answers. In 1952, the abandoned Caldwell property was finally sold by the county for unpaid taxes. The new owner, a lumber company, intended to harvest the timber on the land, but found that local workers were reluctant to enter the property due to its reputation. Several attempts were made to develop the land, but these efforts were consistently hampered by accidents and equipment failures that local residents attributed to the land's dark history. The most significant development occurred in 1956, when construction workers preparing to build an access road discovered additional burial sites in the forest surrounding the former homestead. These discoveries prompted another investigation, led by Sheriff Brennan's successor, Oliver Hutchinson. The new excavations revealed evidence suggesting that the Caldwell crimes had been even more extensive than originally believed, possibly spanning several years and involving numerous victims. Among the remains discovered in 1956 were personal effects that provided the first concrete clues about additional victims of the Caldwell crimes. These items included identification papers belonging to merchants and travelers from neighboring states, suggesting that the Caldwell's activities had attracted victims from a wide geographic area. The systematic nature of the burials indicated careful planning and execution, supporting theories that the crimes had been committed over an extended period rather than as isolated incidents. Perhaps most significant was the discovery of a leather-bound ledger buried with one cache of personal effects. The ledger contained entries in Gideon Caldwell's handwriting that appeared to document various transactions and business dealings. While many entries were cryptic or coded, investigators determined that the ledger represented a record of the Caldwell's criminal activities, including dates, descriptions of victims, and inventories of stolen goods. The ledger revealed that the Caldwell's operation had been more sophisticated than initially suspected. Rather than random attacks on travelers, they appeared to have specifically targeted individuals carrying valuable goods or substantial amounts of cash. The entries suggested that Gideon had developed a network of informants who provided intelligence about potential victims, including details about their travel routes and the valuables they carried. Most disturbing were entries that referenced Minerva's involvement in the crimes. The ledger indicated that she had played an active role in identifying and luring victims, often presenting herself as a harmless mountain woman in need of assistance. Her apparent psychological deterioration, as documented in Dr. Whitman's medical notes, might have been a result of her increasing inability to cope with her active participation in the murders. The 1956 investigation also revealed evidence suggesting that the Caldwells had not acted entirely alone. Several entries in the ledger referenced unnamed associates and mentioned meetings with individuals described only by initials or code names. This discovery raised the possibility that the Caldwell homestead had been part of a larger criminal network operating throughout the Appalachian region. Sheriff Hutchinson's investigation identified several other instances of missing travelers and unexplained disappearances in neighboring counties during the period when the Caldwells had been active. In many cases, the missing individuals had last been seen traveling routes that would have taken them through the area around the Caldwell property. While direct connections could not be established, the pattern suggested that the true scope of the crimes might have been considerably larger than originally suspected. The investigation was concluded in 1957 with the publication of a comprehensive report detailing the findings of both the original 1940 investigation and the subsequent discoveries. The report confirmed that Gideon and Minerva Caldwell had been responsible for multiple murders committed over several years, but their ultimate fate remained unknown. The case was officially classified as involving wanted fugitives, though active investigation was suspended due to the passage of time and the lack of viable leads. In 1962, Dr. Reginald Blackwood, a professor of criminal psychology at West Virginia University, began a comprehensive study of the Caldwell case as part of his research into isolated criminal behavior in rural communities. Dr. Blackwood's analysis, published in 1964, provided new insights into the psychological factors that might have contributed to the Caldwells' criminal activities and their eventual disappearance. According to Dr. Blackwood's findings, the isolation and economic hardships of mountain life could create conditions conducive to the development of criminal behavior, particularly when combined with specific personality traits and environmental factors. The Caldwell's case represented what he termed environmental criminality, where individuals with latent antisocial tendencies were influenced by geographic and social isolation to engage in extreme criminal behavior. Dr. Blackwood's study also addressed the question of what might have ultimately happened to the Caldwells themselves. His analysis suggested that their disappearance was most likely the result of internal conflict within their criminal partnership. Minerva's documented psychological deterioration, combined with evidence of her active participation in the crimes, created a situation where she represented both an essential accomplice and a significant liability. The psychological profile developed by Dr. Blackwood suggested that Gideon possessed classic characteristics of a psychopathic personality, including lack of empathy, manipulative behavior, and an ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while engaging in extreme criminal activity. Minerva, by contrast, appeared to have been gradually drawn into criminal behavior through psychological manipulation and coercion, eventually developing severe psychological symptoms as a result of her involvement. Dr. Blackwood's most controversial conclusion was his theory that Minerva's disappearance might have preceded Gideon's by several days or weeks. He suggested that Gideon might have eliminated his wife when her psychological condition threatened to expose their criminal activities, then continued operating alone until he too decided to disappear. This theory was supported by evidence from the abandoned homestead, including the systematic disposal of physical evidence and the careful maintenance of the house to suggest continued occupation. The study attracted considerable attention within academic circles and renewed public interest in the case. However, it also generated controversy among local residents, many of whom objected to Dr. Blackwood's characterization of mountain culture as conducive to criminal behavior. Several community leaders accused him of perpetuating negative stereotypes about Appalachian people and their way of life. Despite these controversies, Dr. Blackwood's work contributed valuable insights into the case and established it as a significant example in the study of rural criminal behavior. His psychological profiles of the Caldwells became standard reference material in criminal psychology courses, and his theories about their ultimate fate remained the most credible explanation for their disappearance. In 1967, the final significant development in the Caldwell case occurred when a construction crew building a new highway discovered skeletal remains in a remote area approximately 30 miles from the original homestead. The remains were too degraded for positive identification, but forensic analysis suggested they belonged to a middle-aged woman who had died approximately 25 years earlier. Personal effects found with the remains included jewelry, consistent with items known to have belonged to Minerva Caldwell. If these remains did indeed belong to Minerva, they would support Dr. Blackwood's theory that she had been killed by her husband before his own disappearance. The remote location of the discovery site, in an area accessible only by difficult mountain trails, suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental death. However, forensic science of the 1960s was insufficient to provide definitive identification, and the remains were eventually buried in an unmarked grave after legal proceedings determined that no living relatives could be located. Gideon Caldwell's ultimate fate remained unknown. Despite numerous reported sightings over the years, none were ever conclusively verified. Some investigators theorized that he had successfully escaped the region and assumed a new identity elsewhere, possibly using wealth accumulated from his criminal activities to establish himself in a distant location. Others believed that he had died in the mountains, either through accident or suicide, and that his remains simply had not been discovered. The most compelling theory, proposed by retired Sheriff Brennan in a 1968 interview, was that Gideon had continued his criminal activities in other regions, possibly moving through remote areas of multiple states while avoiding law enforcement detection. Brennan noted that similar patterns of missing travelers and isolated murders had been reported in various Appalachian communities during the 1940s and 1950s, though no direct connections to the Caldwell case could be established. By the 1970s, active investigation of the Caldwell case had ceased, and it became primarily a subject of historical and academic interest. The property where the homestead had stood was eventually developed into a small recreational area, though local residents continued to avoid the location due to its reputation. Signs of the former buildings and evidence of the criminal activities had long since been erased by time and deliberate removal. The case continued to influence local folklore and regional literature, inspiring numerous fictional accounts and becoming part of the oral tradition of the mountain communities. However, these retellings often embellished or distorted the actual facts, contributing to a mythology that sometimes obscured the genuine historical significance of the events. In academic circles, the Caldwell case remained an important reference point for studies of rural criminal behavior, family dynamics and criminal partnerships, and the psychological effects of geographic isolation. The extensive documentation preserved from the various investigations provided researchers with a detailed record of criminal behavior patterns that continued to yield insights decades after the original events. The true impact of the Caldwell crimes extended beyond the immediate victims and their families. The case fundamentally changed attitudes about safety and trust within the mountain communities, contributing to increased wariness toward strangers and greater reluctance to offer assistance to travelers. These changes in social behavior persisted for generations, representing a lasting legacy of the fear and mistrust generated by the Caldwell's actions. The question of what motivated Gideon and Minerva Caldwell to begin their criminal activities remained subject to speculation. Economic hardship during the Great Depression certainly created pressures that might have contributed to their decision to prey on travelers, but many other families face similar difficulties without resorting to murder. The systematic nature of their crimes suggested planning and deliberation rather than desperate acts committed in moments of crisis. Dr. Blackwood's psychological analysis proposed that the combination of geographic isolation, economic stress, and specific personality traits created conditions that enabled the Caldwell's transformation from struggling farmers into serial killers. However, this explanation remained theoretical, as the perpetrators themselves were never apprehended or interviewed about their motivations and methods. The investigation files preserved in the Webster County Archives continued to attract researchers and crime historians who hoped to uncover new evidence or insights into the case. However, the passage of time had eliminated most potential witnesses and degraded physical evidence to the point where significant new discoveries seemed unlikely. The case remained officially open but inactive, representing one of West Virginia's most notorious unsolved mysteries. In recent decades, advances in forensic science have prompted occasional suggestions that the preserved evidence from the Caldwell case might be re-examined using modern techniques. However, the limited nature of the remaining physical evidence and the advanced age of the case make such efforts impractical and unlikely to yield meaningful results. The skeletal remains discovered in 1967, which might have belonged to Minerva Caldwell, were never subjected to DNA analysis and are no longer available for testing. The legacy of the Caldwell case extends beyond its impact on local communities and criminal psychology research. The systematic nature of the crimes and the mysterious disappearance of the perpetrators established it as one of the most significant criminal cases in Appalachian history. The combination of multiple murders, sophisticated criminal operations, and unresolved questions about the criminal's ultimate fate created a case that continues to fascinate researchers and writers decades after the original events. For the families of the identified victims, the case provided some measure of closure regarding the fate of their loved ones, even though the perpetrators were never brought to justice. The discovery of personal effects and the documentation of the crimes at least confirmed what had happened to individuals who had simply disappeared while traveling through the mountain region. However, the likelihood that additional victims were never identified meant that some families never learned the truth about missing relatives. The Caldwell homestead itself became a symbol of the hidden dangers that could exist within seemingly peaceful rural communities. The fact that such extensive criminal activity could occur in an isolated mountain setting without detection for years challenged assumptions about the safety and innocence of rural life. The case demonstrated how geographic isolation could enable criminal behavior while simultaneously concealing it from law enforcement and the broader community. As the decades passed and the original investigators and witnesses died, the Caldwell case gradually transitioned from active criminal investigation to historical curiosity. The documented evidence preserved in official records provided researchers with detailed insights into criminal behavior patterns, but the human drama of the original events became increasingly remote. The case serves as a reminder that rural areas, despite their appearance of tranquility, can harbor secrets and dangers that rival those found in urban settings. The question of whether Gideon Caldwell survived his disappearance and continued his criminal activities elsewhere remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. The skills and methods he demonstrated in the documented crimes, combined with his apparent ability to avoid detection for years, suggest that he possessed the capabilities necessary for successful flight and reinvention. However, the lack of verified sightings or confirmed criminal activities matching his patterns in other locations suggests that if he did survive, he either ceased his criminal behavior or was extremely successful in avoiding detection. The case also illustrates the challenges faced by rural law enforcement agencies in investigating complex criminal activities. Sheriff Brennan and his successors worked with limited resources and manpower while dealing with crime scenes scattered across difficult terrain. The isolation that enabled the Caldwell's criminal activities also complicated efforts to investigate and prosecute their crimes. Modern law enforcement agencies, with improved communication systems and forensic capabilities, would likely have detected and stopped the criminal activities much earlier. For students of criminal psychology, the Caldwell case provides insights into the development of criminal partnerships and the psychological factors that enable individuals to engage in repeated acts of extreme violence. The contrast between Gideon's apparent psychopathic traits and Minerva's gradual psychological deterioration illustrates different pathways into criminal behavior and different psychological responses to involvement in violent crimes. The case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about rural crime and the challenges of providing law enforcement services to remote communities. The geographic factors that enabled the Caldwell's crimes isolation, limited transportation infrastructure, and sparse population continue to characterize many rural areas. Understanding how these factors contributed to the Caldwell crimes provides insights that remain applicable to modern law enforcement strategies. The documentation preserved from the Caldwell investigation also serves as an important historical record of rural life during the Great Depression era. The details contained in witness statements, property records, and personal effects provide insights into the daily lives, economic conditions, and social relationships of mountain communities during a period of significant hardship and change. This historical value ensures that the case will continue to attract scholarly attention regardless of whether new developments occur in the criminal investigation. The ultimate mystery of what happened to Gideon and Minerva Caldwell may never be resolved. The passage of time has eliminated most possibilities for new evidence or witnesses, and the geographic challenges that complicated the original investigation remain unchanged. However, the case will likely continue to generate speculation and theories as new researchers examine the preserved evidence and attempt to solve the puzzle of the criminal's disappearance. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Caldwell case is its demonstration that ordinary people, faced with specific circumstances and pressures, can be capable of extraordinary evil. The transformation of struggling mountain farmers into systematic killers illustrates the potential for criminal behavior that exists within all communities, regardless of their apparent character or reputation. This sobering lesson remains relevant as communities throughout rural America continue to grapple with crime, isolation, and the economic pressures that can drive individuals toward desperate actions. The winds that blow through the hollows and ridges of Webster County today carry no trace of the Caldwell homestead or the crimes that occurred there more than 8 decades ago. The land has returned to forest, and new generations have grown up with only vague awareness of the events that once made their community notorious throughout the region. Yet the questions raised by the case, the capacity for evil within ordinary people, the challenges of justice in isolated communities, and the mystery of what ultimately became of the perpetrators continue to resonate with anyone who studies the darker aspects of human nature and rural crime. And perhaps in some remote corner of America, an elderly man carries secrets that could finally solve the mystery of what really happened during those dark winter months of 1940, when the Caldwell homestead became the site of unspeakable crimes. Until such revelations emerge, the case remains an enduring puzzle, a reminder that some questions about human behavior and criminal activity may never receive satisfactory answers, leaving us to contemplate the mysteries that lie hidden within our own communities and within the human capacity for both good and evil.